Welcome back. This is The Globe. Human Rights Watch has expressed deep sadness over the sudden death of its Southern Africa director and outspoken human rights activist Dewa Mavhinga. The cause of his death is still unclear, but some publications have reported that he has succumbed to COVID-19 in South Africa. News of Mavhinga's demise sent shockwaves among the civil rights, journalists and opposition activist community in Southern Africa and beyond, with many using social media to send their condolences. Now, Human Rights Watch says the Zimbabwean national has led effective campaigns for respect of human rights across borders. The organization says Dewa was a deeply empathetic and highly effective human rights activist whose work made many people's lives better. Mavhinga joined Human Rights Watch as senior Zimbabwe researcher in 2012. He spent years documenting human rights violations in his native country during the turbulent and violent final years of President Robert Mugabe's government. As Southern Africa director, Mavhinga oversaw and supported a broad range of work in the region aimed at ensuring human rights for all. This included exposing and ending political repression, forced evictions of indigenous people, violence and discrimination against women, LGBTQI+ community and foreigners. He also demanded access to clean water and fair distribution of vaccines and COVID-19 relief packages. To get an intimate understanding of the important contribution Dewa Mavhinga made in human rights promotion and protection in the SADC region and the world, let's invite now Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, to speak to us. Mr. Roth, a very good evening to you and condolences to your colleagues, his family and friends. And I concur with a great deal of what I've said about Mr. Mavhinga, always helpful, very passionate about his work. Perhaps you can first start by telling us the first time you met him and under what circumstances.
Well, I've known Dewa for a good part of a decade. As you indicated, he started off as our Zimbabwe researcher, doing incredibly courageous work, documenting atrocities in the context of the Mavhinga diamond fields, addressing the repression under the Mugabe government, and then his responsibilities broadened over time. I mean, I think you captured him well in your introduction in the sense that this was, on the one hand, an incredibly kind, compassionate, almost gentle person. He would, identify with victims of human rights abuse that he was documenting. But he was also an incredibly fierce advocate. He was beautifully articulate. He was sought after by the media. And my colleagues and I at Human Rights Watch are completely shocked by his sudden death. This was utterly unexpected. He was, vigorous one day and gone the next. So we are all, in shock and mourning at the loss of a true leader of our movement.
Has there been any indication yet from the family what was the source of Mr. Mavhinga's death?
At this point, we really don't know. I mean, I know the media has been reporting that it was from COVID complications, but it was so fast. COVID doesn't usually move that quickly. So I think we just don't know at this stage, and we'll have to wait until we get, more medical analysis.
So let's go back to his body of work, Diamonds in the Rough, Human Rights Abuses in Zimbabwe's Mavhinga Diamond Fields. Tell us a little bit more about his work and his involvement there.
Well, he, first of all, was the one who really courageously was in the field documenting, literally murder in the context of the mining of diamonds in Mavhinga. He was very intimately involved in launching the so-called Kimberley process, which was an effort to, fight against blood diamonds, but ended up being too narrow and ended up focusing more on, non-governmental groups and irregular mining rather than the formal mining of the sort that was in Mavhinga. And, interestingly, the major publication Foreign Policy just 2 days ago quoted Dewa criticizing the prospect that Zimbabwe might take over the chairmanship of the Kimberley process. So, this was in many ways one of his trademarks, but his work was quite broad and expansive. As you noted in his introduction, he was very focused on access to clean water, on the rights of LGBT people, on protecting women and girls from violence, He had, a very broad mandate that extended, throughout the SADC region. This was not just Zimbabwe. In the end, he was our Southern Africa director. And he was, just this last week, we've been dealing with him around access to vaccines for COVID, equitable access around the world. We were dealing with him around, kind of enlisting the South African government in fighting apartheid of the Israeli government in the occupied territories. So he, had a broad mandate and was super effective. So, beyond the personal shock of losing a close friend and colleague, this is a real loss for our movement.
I mean, as you speak about, it wasn't just Zimbabwe, it was the Southern Africa region. One of the things that I had spoken to him on several occasions was on the vestiges of apartheid, particularly the land issue. That is something that he wrote about, land in post-colonial states. Perhaps if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, in South Africa, he was very concerned about the ongoing injustices, the ongoing inequality, the ongoing discrimination that stands in the way of so many South Africans being, full participants in their society and full beneficiaries of the rights that they are due. So he was, he was someone who really identified with the downtrodden and the left behind. And he would, really, not only meet these people and gain their trust, but then serve as a very effective voice to ensure that the concerns of people who might not be heard by senior public officials, he would insist that they listen and press them vigorously to pay attention to these neglected people, to respect their basic rights to the most essential economic and social needs, whether it's housing or clean water or what have you.
Talk to us about him as a friend. You speak fondly about that aspect of him. What can you share with us?
Well, within Human Rights Watch, he was a real leader. There was a certain stature to him, a dignity. When he spoke, people listened. And he was extremely thoughtful, but also so kind. He befriended people left and right. And so, my colleagues, as we put out the word yesterday evening of Dewa's death, there was this outpouring of mourning, of sadness, but also respect for the man. Everybody thinks fondly of Dewa. And I think he touched many, many people's hearts. Not only the people in the communities where he worked, but also his colleagues within Human Rights Watch.
A final word to his family, his friends, the legacy that he leaves behind?
Well, his wife, Fiona, his 4 children, on the one hand, my heart goes out to them. It's horrible to lose a father, a husband in the prime of his life. But I think that they also have much to be proud of. This is a man who left his mark, who made his contribution, and who will always be remembered with the greatest fondness and respect. And in many ways, that's the most that any of us can hope for when we pass away.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, speaking to us about the life and work of Dewa Mavhinga. We'll be speaking to a colleague as well in just a moment, but just sharing with us their experiences of working with him, the impact he's had really not only on those that he worked with, but of course changing the minds of regimes that were against the concept of human rights, in some cases accused of making it a westernized idea, but him bringing it home to communities in Zimbabwe. As you heard, that he was often working in the fields of those diamond fields when he was reported about the human rights violations there. So Dewa Mavhinga, also a very ardent Twitter on some of those issues. One of the things that he wrote about not so long ago, a tweet saying Nangagwa, a life of sacrifice, biography, this is General Chiwenga, and he has been celebrated really by quite a few colleagues. Human Rights Watch putting out that tweet 22 hours ago saying our beloved colleague Dewa Mavhinga passed away suddenly overnight. He had just returned to Johannesburg after a research mission in Zimbabwe. We are heartbroken and devastated by the news. Our priority right now is to support his family. And David Roth there saying that there's been no confirmation yet that he has died of COVID-19 complications, as is the speculation. Well, to share some insights now on the significance of the work of Southern Africa Director of Human Rights Watch and outspoken human rights activist Dewa Mavhinga is internationally renowned Zimbabwean journalist Hopeful Chinono. Hopeful, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and condolences to you. I know you knew Dewa quite well. If you could just share with us the journey that you've shared with him.
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. It's a very sad and tragic moment for those of us who knew Dewa personally, and even those who never met him but were impacted by his monumental body of work. He was a general giant. He was somebody who was so easy to talk to, very respectable, and he held a huge office responsible for the whole of Southern Africa. But if you met him, if you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't know that this is the kind of office that is held by this man that I'm talking to. He was always willing to listen. A lot of people in those positions want to talk a lot, but he was more interested in listening, taking notes. You would see that even if he entered into discourse on Twitter and there were arguments, whenever he was insulted, he would sidetrack those insults and focus on the real issues that are being discussed. So his demise, his passing, is a huge loss, not only to Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, but to the rest of the continent and the rest of the world, because as his boss, Kenneth Roth, said, a lot of the work that Dewa did had so much impact on a lot of ordinary people who ordinarily would not have been having somebody assisting them, especially when they're going through political persecution. I remember when I was in prison, when I was arrested the first time last year in July, Dewa was an advocate. When I came out, I saw a lot of interviews that he did on SABC, ENCA, talking about how I was being persecuted and talking about how journalists in general were being harassed in Zimbabwe. So his passing is a very big loss, one that will take a long time for people to actually accept that the man is gone.
And just speaking about that persecution that Dewa suffered, Hopeful, he was also very quick to help, not only with resources of whatever journalists needed in order to have the facts at their fingertips, but also to give a fuller picture of what exactly is going on in whatever area that he worked in. So if you could just share a little bit about that work and the persecution that he faced.
When he started off in 2012 as a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch, he was operating in Zimbabwe. It was a very volatile environment. In 2008, 2009, we'd just gone through a post-election violence where over 400 people were killed, and thousands had their hands cut off, fingers cut off. And he was at the heart of that. He was at the heart of documenting all that stuff. In 2013, again, we had another election which was contested between Robert Mugabe and the late Morgan Tsvangirai. Again, Dewa was there documenting all the harassment that was taking place. He had a gift. His gift was to be calm. His gift was to be humble. He would easily gel into any space, whether it's an executive office or going into the townships or rural areas. That's the kind of person that he was. He was someone who was determined to make sure that the people's human rights were respected. I remember there was a time, just after the coup in 2017, he came to my home. That was the first time that I met him. We had sort of discussed on Twitter. I was one of those people that thought there was going to be a point of departure after Robert Mugabe's removal. They were thought otherwise, but he came to my home and we engaged. And I grew fondly and really admired the kind of person that he was, the kind of work that he was doing. And it wasn't just about journalists, it was about any sort of human rights. As you said in your introduction, he was always there. And it was so easy for Zimbabweans to engage with him. A lot of young people referred to him as Mkoma Dewa, which is like Big Brother Dewa. I saw today on social media, especially on Twitter, even those that argued with him from a ZANU-PF perspective, today, a lot of them, they've got his pictures as their profile picture. That speaks loads about the kind of man that he was.
And this is the point that I was going to, Hopeful, that he managed to traverse the political divides. I saw a tweet also from your former Prime Minister, Professor Mutambara, praising him, his work, and saying, gone too soon. Just talk about the impact he's had on the political landscape in terms of improving human rights, engendering them for ordinary Zimbabweans to claim as their birthright.
A lot of people who work in human rights, some of them, they've got different styles of doing their work. Some are very adversarial, and he was the opposite. I saw today one of the former ZANU-PF ministers tweeting about him as well. It shows you that he was able to cross the line from what was perceived to be the good guys to the bad guys and engage with them, but engage with them meaningfully. In a lot of the cases that we have seen, some people end up trading barbs on Twitter, trading barbs on Facebook, but Dewa was not like that. He wanted to understand what the problem was. He wanted to then come up with a solution. He did not believe in just shouting that things are bad. He looked for solutions. And that testimony is seen in how even people in ZANU-PF today are genuinely commiserating with his family and the greater human rights family of the world.
Just a final word from you, Hopewell, on young people who are looking on, as we talk about this, the work he's done. But obviously it was difficult to be able to stand up for those values and principles that he believed in. But just to convince them that it is worth the hardship, the journey, that the impact will be felt by generations to come.
His work was so deep, it was so meaningful, it was so touching. That is why everybody's talking about him since we had the sad news that he had passed on. There are so many people that have come as directors of human rights organizations, and they've never left the kind of mark that Dewa has left. It speaks into the kind of person that he was. He was genuine. He was not interested in the trappings of the office. The office just came with a job, but he was more interested in spending time with people, in fighting for people. One day you'd see him on Twitter advocating for human rights in Zimbabwe, and people in ZANU-PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, will be upset with him. And the next day, he's in Eswatini. What I found very interesting, there were some very comic moments in how he did his work. You would find that if something is happening in Eswatini, Zimbabweans who would have been arguing with him would be tweeting that, Dewa, did you hear what's happening in Eswatini? What are you going to do about it?
All right.
He became the person that people spoke to when there were issues around the sub-region.
Hope will really appreciate that. And internationally renowned Zimbabwean journalist Hopewell Chinono sharing his memories and experiences of Dewa Mavhinga. That's how we leave it for